Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet. He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
It's how many millions of people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, you know, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children. So then what is so great about Jesus?
For a good part of my life, I wasn't a Christian. And actually, my father's family was quite a famous atheist family in 19th century Britain. My grandfather, who was Victorian actually, he was great friends with George Bernard Shaw, who was the sort of poster boy of the humanist movement in his day. So growing up, I was not really a churchgoer. And anything to do with Christianity, if I'm honest, I found rather boring, and it seemed quite irrelevant. But what happened was, when I was in my teens, I went to a party, and I met someone there who was a Christian. And this really shocked me, because firstly, they were normal, and secondly, I knew from my time at school with them a few years ago before that they were really smart. And I thought, how could somebody who's intelligent believe all that stuff in the Bible? So I devised what I thought at the time was a cunning plan. I thought, okay, I'll read the Bible, I'll see all of the obvious errors in it, and then I'll be able to save my friend from the error of their ways. So I got hold of a New Testament in the Bible, and in the front cover there was a daily reading plan. It gave you a number of verses to read every day. And if you did that for a year, it took you through the whole New Testament. So that's what I decided to do. But I was too embarrassed to let anyone know I was doing this. So I used to hide this little Bible under the carpet, under my bed. And last thing at night when I got into bed, I would pull it out and I'd do the day's reading, and then I'd put it back underneath. And I did that every night for a whole year without telling anyone. And it was one night during that year, I remember it like it was yesterday. I'd finished the reading, it was about Jesus, and I closed the book, and I thought, oh my goodness, it's all true. Jesus is who he says he is. Now, why did I come to that conclusion? What's the evidence? Well, I don't believe you can prove Christianity like a kind of mathematical proof, nor do I think you can prove it with a scientific proof, nor even a philosophical proof. But it is based on evidence, more like historical evidence, the kind of evidence you might present in a legal case in a court of law. You know, as an undergraduate, I studied history at Oxford University. So for me, evidence is really important. I don't think I could take just a blind leap of faith. No, for me, it's a question of taking a reasonable step of faith based on good evidence. Evidence for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. As I said, you can't prove Christianity scientifically nor mathematically. Science answers the questions of how and when, but it doesn't answer the questions of why and whom. Now, I have a little visual aid, if I may. So here's a cake. Thank you, Sarah. It looks quite an impressive cake. Now, if I sent this cake to scientists and they analyzed it, they could probably tell me how this cake was made. They could probably tell me the ingredients in it And they might even be able to tell me when it was made. But they wouldn't be able to tell me why it was made and who made it. Only the maker can reveal that. Before I drop it, man, thank you. Only the maker can reveal that. And obviously science is important. But it doesn't tell us why, and it doesn't tell us who. It doesn't pretend to tell us those answers. Those matters are matters of faith. And it takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian. Because just as you can't scientifically prove that God exists, you can't scientifically prove that he doesn't exist either. It's a matter of faith. It's a matter of weighing the evidence. And that's what I want to look at tonight, because I want us to look at the historical evidence, because scientific evidence isn't the only kind of evidence. Now, if you're thinking, well, hold on a minute, Miles, I'm not even sure I believe there's a God. Why are we already talking about Jesus? Then I understand why you're saying that. Because that's what I thought. Before I came to faith, I thought the same thing. Why bother talking about Jesus? I don't even believe there's a God. But for a reason I'll come on to later, I found that actually it was through the life, death, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus that I came to believe that there is a God. Now, if God does exist, we could only know him if he chooses to reveal himself to us. And that's the claim of the New Testament, that God's done precisely that. And he's done it in a way that sort of makes sense. If he wanted to reveal himself to us, human beings, then it would kind of be logical for him to become a human himself, to reveal himself. And for me, it was the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that convinced me that the world has a creator. So what is the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is there's a great deal of evidence for this. First of all, there's evidence outside of the New Testament. The Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about him. The first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus wrote this: "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles." And then Josephus goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But there's also evidence inside the New Testament. Now, you might say, okay, Miles, but the New Testament was written a very long time ago. How do we know that over the years, what was originally written has not been edited or redacted or changed to what we have today? How do we know what was in the original? Well, the answer is we know very well through a science called textual criticism. Textual criticism says that the earlier the date and the smaller the gap between when the original text was written and the earliest manuscript that we still have to date, the smaller the gap between the two, and the more copies of that manuscript that we have, the more confident we can be that we know exactly what was in the original. So let's compare with some other ancient texts. And you can look this up in the manual if you wish. So, for example, you'll see Herodotus and Thucydides, both written in the 5th century BC. You can see it on the screen. Both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copies we have is AD 900 for both. So that's a 1,300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year gap between the original and the earliest manuscript we have, and we have 20 copies of that manuscript. Caesar's Gallic Wars, there was 950-year gap, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap, 20 copies. But when it comes to the New Testament, It was written between 40 and 100 AD. The earliest manuscript we have is AD 130, and we have, that's a tiny gap, and we have 5,309 manuscripts in the original Greek, 10,000 in Latin, and 9,300 in other languages. So as the greatest textual critic of all time, F.J. Hort, put it, he said, "In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings." And no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So from both outside and inside the New Testament, we know that Jesus existed. But who was he? Well, we know he was fully human. He had a body. He ate, drank, sweated, got tired, suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness, human experiences. He grew up in a family, had a job. He had the experience of being tempted. He experienced bereavement, suffering, being tortured, and ultimately dying. But many would say, okay, that's fine. He was a human being, but only a human being, albeit maybe he was a great religious teacher too. Well, what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? And there are really two parts to the argument here. The first part is to ask, well, who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus thought he was just a man and a religious teacher, well, that's really the end of the argument. And some people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. And true, he didn't go around with a t-shirt on saying, "I am God." But when we look in a moment at what Jesus taught and said, I think we'll see there's little doubt that he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. That's the first part of the argument. Who did Jesus think he was? Then the second part is to say, well, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So firstly, what did Jesus say about himself? There are three bits of evidence here. First of all, his teaching centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. But Jesus, who was the most humble and self-effacing person who ever lived, in pointing people to God, pointed to himself. He said, it's through me that you come to a relationship with God. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you want that spiritual hunger inside you satisfied, come to me. You know, addictions are a major problem in our world today. And Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, if I set you free, then you'll be free indeed. Many people are depressed or disillusioned. They feel like they're living in darkness. Maybe you feel like that. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And I suppose that was my experience. You know, I've kind of felt like I'd been stumbling around in the dark. But when I encountered Jesus, it was like a light went on. Jesus said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you've seen me, you've seen God. There was a 5-year-old girl who was drawing a picture, and her mother said, what are you drawing, dear? And she said, well, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the mother said, well, don't be silly. Nobody knows what God looks like. And the little girl said, well, they will do in a moment when I've finished. Jesus said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. Then, secondly, there's the things that Jesus said where he kind of put himself in a position where only God can really be. So, for example, Jesus went around saying to people, your sins are forgiven. Now, if someone offends you, you can forgive them. But if somebody offends somebody else, only that person can forgive them, or God can do that. And that's why when Jesus went around saying, your sins are forgiven, The teachers of the law at the time said, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And Jesus claimed to be able to do that. In fact, he said, "I've come to give my life that you can be forgiven." And forgiveness is right at the heart of the Christian faith. A Christian is someone who forgives the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in them. The third piece of evidence are Jesus' direct claims. If somebody says to you, look, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only had time to show them one passage of Scripture, I'd recommend you show them this one. It's John chapter 10, verses 30 to 33. Now, the background to this is in Jesus' day, if you claimed to be God, that was blasphemy, and the punishment was stoning. So verse 30 says this, Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." Again, they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, "I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me?" "We're not stoning you for any of these," they replied, "but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God." So that's the first part of the argument. What did Jesus say about himself? And we can see that he believed that he was human, but God as well, the Son of God. Well, how do we test such a claim? Well, I think, logically speaking, there are only three possible options. Either number one, Jesus claimed to be God, but knew that he wasn't God, in which case he was an imposter, a fraud, and an evil one at that. The second option is that Jesus genuinely believed that he was God, but he wasn't, in which case he was deluded or insane. The only third logical possibility is that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and he was. C.S. Lewis put it this way: "A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else insane, or something worse. But don't let us come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to." So what evidence is there to support the claim of who he is? Well, firstly, we might look at his teaching. What did Jesus teach? And the teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching ever to fall from human lips. He said, "Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others as you would have them do to you." And uniquely, he said, "Love your neighbors and love your enemy. Turn the other cheek." Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of our civilization in huge parts of the world. Most of our laws today are originally based on the teaching of Jesus. We're making progress in every field of science and technology, but no one's ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the sort of words you might expect God to speak. Then secondly, there's his lifestyle. What did Jesus do? It must have been extraordinary to be around Jesus. It wasn't boring at all. There was a party, you may know the story he was at, the wine ran out, and Jesus said, "Don't worry, fill those stone jars over there, put 20 to 30 of gallons of water into each of the jars, and then pour it out for the guests." And as they poured it out for the guests, out came Chateau Lafite 45, BC. And not just his miracles, there was his love that he showed for the loveless, for the people whom society had written off, the outcasts, and the way he set people free and is still setting people free today. And then, of course, there was his death, the way he laid down his life, not just for his friends, but for his enemies as well. Then there's his character. Jesus' character has impressed millions who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of humanity. And look at Jesus' courage. When he was being tortured just before he was crucified, he prayed, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." Scripture says of him, he has done all things beautifully. Could such a person really be evil or unbalanced? The fourth piece of evidence is his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else has ever had a whole collection of books written about them before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies spoken by different voices down the centuries. 29 prophecies he fulfilled in a single day. Now, it could be suggested that maybe he was a really clever con man who sat down, he looked at all of the prophecies in the Old Testament and then set out to try and fulfill them all. Now, this is quite unlikely. Firstly, because of the sheer number of the prophecies, but also because, humanly speaking, he didn't have control over many of them. So, for example, there were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, prophecies about the exact place of his burial. That's quite hard to control. And also prophecies about his exact place of birth. You know, if he was a conman, he couldn't look up and go, "Oh, goodness, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem." It's too late. And then the final and fifth piece of evidence, and this is by far the most important, and that is his conquest of death. The physical resurrection of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. And it is relevant to every single person in this room. Why? Because one day, we're all going to die. That's the ultimate statistic. 1 in 1 dies. Now, we don't like to talk about death. Often we try and avoid talking about it. I heard of a hospital recently that have stopped talking about deaths. Instead, they talk about negative patient care outcomes. But nevertheless, people die. And it looks final, doesn't it? It looks final. And it is, unless it's true that Jesus died, was buried, and then was raised to new life. And it's the claim of the New Testament that because he did rise to new life, it's therefore possible one day for you and for me and for our loved ones to be raised to new life as well. That's the greatest hope that we have through Jesus Christ. Now, is that just wishful thinking? No, because there's good evidence that Jesus died and was raised to life. What is that evidence? Well, the Romans were absolute experts at execution. They knew what they were doing when it came to crucifixion. And we're told in the accounts of how Jesus was crucified on the cross, he died, and then at the end, just to make sure, the Romans stuck a spear into his side. When they pulled the spear out came a flow of blood and water. Medically speaking, that's a separation of blood and serum, which shows that he was medically dead. So he died. So what then is the evidence that the resurrection then happened? And here there are really 4 main headings to summarize this. Firstly, there was the absence of Jesus' body from the tomb. The location of the tomb is well documented, and there have been many theories put forward to try and explain why on that first Easter Sunday, when the disciples looked into the tomb, his body was absent. But those theories are pretty unconvincing. Some people say, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. And then once the disciples had stole the body, they began a rumor that Jesus had been raised to life. Now, leaving aside the fact that the tomb was very well guarded, psychologically, this is very improbable. That a group of depressed, disillusioned people, because their leader had died, that they would suddenly go through everything they went through for their beliefs. Ian Walker, a scientist at Cambridge, he came to become a Christian because he said, I could not believe that the disciples would have been willing to be tortured and die for something that they would have known, if they'd taken the body, was not true. Other people say, well, maybe grave robbers stole the body. Now, this is the least likely of all explanations, because the reason why grave robbers stole the bodies was not for the bodies. There was no monetary value in the body. They stole it because of the value of the grave clothes that the corpse was wrapped in. Now, you will have noticed so far, I've not spoken of the empty tomb. I've just said Jesus' body was absent, because the tomb was not empty. In fact, when the disciples got there, they found that the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, had collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterfly comes out. And next to it separately was the headcloth that would have been wrapped around Jesus' face, wrapped up and neatly placed there. The only things of value for robbers were still there. That's why when the disciples looked in, it says they saw and believed. So the first piece of evidence for the resurrection, the absence of Jesus' body. The second piece of evidence is Jesus' presence with the disciples. They saw the risen Jesus. Now, you could say, hallucinations. Well, yeah, people can hallucinate. But it's highly unlikely that even just two people would hallucinate the same thing at the same time. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions over a 6-week period after his resurrection. On one occasion, we're told, he appeared to 500 eyewitnesses at the same time. 500 people do not hallucinate the same thing at the same time. And look at the nature of those appearances. Hallucinations tend to be subjective. They have no objective reality. It's a bit like seeing a ghost. But Luke chapter 24 tells us how the risen Jesus appeared to the disciples, and he said, look, touch my hands, touch my side, and they physically touched him. Then he asked for a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it in front of them. I know somebody called James, and James came to faith because he said, there's no way a ghost would eat fish. And then look at the types of people that saw the risen Jesus. There was Thomas. He was a cynic, a skeptic, and yet he saw. The others were fishermen, down-to-earth, commonsensical people, and they were tax collectors. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. Third piece of evidence for the resurrection was the immediate impact that it had. So there was this group of disillusioned, depressed disciples, and then something must have happened, because suddenly they went out full of joy and boldly said, Jesus is alive. We've seen him. And then you get this historical phenomenon that is the birth and growth of the church. From that small group of disciples, within just 300 years, the church had spread across the whole of the known world. And this is a story of a peaceful revolution that is unparalleled in history. Fourth piece of evidence for the resurrection is that of Christian experience down the ages. You know, that evidence is still there today. Jesus is changing people's lives who encounter him. Today, about 1/3 of the world is Christian. Over 2.3 billion believers who claim to have encountered Jesus in their heart. They come from every ethnicity, every continent, every nationality, different economic, socio-demographic backgrounds, different intellectual backgrounds. It doesn't matter who you are. And they all have this one claim in common, to have an encounter with Jesus. Now, I told you at the beginning that through reading the New Testament, I came to the conclusion it was true. I'll be honest with you, I didn't want to come to that conclusion. In fact, I thought if I came to that conclusion, my life would be over. It would be boring. But the evidence convinced me it was true. And the moment I said yes to Jesus, at that moment, I experienced what I think unconsciously I'd always been searching for. Suddenly, I found new purpose and meaning in my life through a relationship with Jesus. It's the last place I expected to find it, but that was my experience. You know, I've messed up a lot. I've had a lot of struggles in my life, and I still have struggles. And you know, if you become a Christian, it's not like your life is suddenly perfect. But what I have found is that when Jesus said, "I have come that you might have life, and life in all of its fullness," in my experience, that's been exactly true. That's what he brings. He brings life in all of its fullness. Thank you so much for listening. It's now time for coffee and small groups.